we'll get started now. I'd like to, first of all, thank you for being here and thank Tamkeen and the organizers for putting this session together. I'd like to introduce my panel. My name is Omar Al-Ubaidli. I'm the Director of Research at the Bahrain Center for Strategic International Energy Studies. My colleague on my left is Professor Kelly Shaver, who is a social psychologist and a professor of entrepreneurship at Charleston College in the US, as well as being the president of a company called Mindcette, which we'll be discussing during today's presentation. And then we have Dr. Yamo Kotiline, who is the Chief Planning and Monitoring Officer at Tamkeen, and he's a Bahrain-based economist. So thank you very much. I'll start off with a brief presentation. So this, for some of you in the audience attended yesterday's session, which was delivered by Kelly and Betsy Shaver, who's in the back. She's the Vice President of Operations at Mindcette. They presented there the tools in this entrepreneurial surveying company called Mindcette. So today's a follow-up session where we discuss actually what we did in Bahrain and what the results were. So there'll be a brief presentation, and then we'll have some short interventions by my colleagues, and then we'll have an open Q&A. So hopefully it'll be an interactive one. So what are entrepreneurial attributes? Humans have different skills, as you know, things like strength, intelligence, diligence, attention to detail, and so on. Different bundles of skills are different for use for different jobs. So, for example, if I'm a surgeon, it's preferable that I be dexterous and unflappable. If I'm a social worker, it's nice if I have good empathy. Now, being a successful entrepreneur is also associated with a specific bundle of skills. Some of them all scholars agree upon, something like leadership. Anyone who's been studying entrepreneurship would conclude that being a good leader is something that contributes to being a good entrepreneur. Others are a little bit more controversial. So, for example, how risk tolerant you are, how willing you are to bear risk may or may not make you a better entrepreneur. Now, the Mindcette entrepreneurial test, there are many different, these are, Shelley, oh, hold on. Here we go. Okay, these are my colleagues, Kelly and Betsy. And this is the logo of Mindcette. So there are many different techniques for measuring entrepreneurial skills. Now, the Mindcette entrepreneurial test asks participants to answer 72 questions about themselves. Things like you rate yourself on a question such as, I am very hardworking, or an item specifically. I'm very hardworking. I'm able to solve problems when I face them. And you rate yourself in these questions. And there's 72 of them, these statements. And these data are then used to calculate your ability in 9 different dimensions: confidence, diligence, entrepreneurial desire, focus, innovation, leadership, motives, resilience, and self-control. Now, this Mindcette test has various advantages compared to the numerous tests that exist on the market. Among them, first of all, it's been developed by a world-renowned social psychologist who specializes in entrepreneurship. Secondly, it uses sophisticated statistical techniques to validate the methods. Thirdly, it distinguishes between men and women. So anyone who attended yesterday's session will have had that clarified to them. All the existing tests actually fail to even draw a distinction between men and women, and when in fact there are very important differences between the two. It's been peer-reviewed, and it has won awards. So when we decided in Bahrain to measure entrepreneurial abilities, these are the reasons we picked Mindcette. And these are the reasons actually why the Global Entrepreneurship Network considers Mindcette its flagship measure of entrepreneurial ability. Okay, so why would anyone want to measure entrepreneurial attributes? Well, the first reason, if in Bahrain we do measure them, so what? I'll give you 4 reasons why we want to measure entrepreneurial attributes. The first is that it allows for international comparisons. I can compare Bahrain to other countries. Secondly, it allows comparisons across time, which is an important KPI for Bahrain's Economic Vision 2030. So for those of you who are not familiar with Bahrain's current economic strategy, we have a vision that was launched in 2008. And the primary component of this vision is, or the primary goal, is to make Bahrainis more entrepreneurial, and in particular to make the private sector a much more important driver of economic growth in the economy than it has been historically. Now, therefore, if we're trying to make people more entrepreneurial, we need to be able to measure that. And up until we came across this mindset test, there wasn't really any reliable way or coherent way of saying, well, this vision is succeeding in making people more entrepreneurial than it was in the past. So these are the two reasons at the aggregate level. Then at the microeconomic level, at the level of individuals, it allows for screening of applicants for entrepreneurial programs. So Tamkeen, which Dr. Kotiline represents, has a multitude of programs designed for improving entrepreneurial abilities, along with its sister organizations such as the Bahrain Development Bank and the EDB and so on and so forth. And using tests of entrepreneurability can help you screen applicants, and also it can help you tailor the resources that you have for training. So once I know that, for example, Kelly as a candidate scores well on leadership but doesn't score very well on communication, then we can focus improving him on communication, and then if I'm good in communication, vice versa on leadership, can improve my leadership rather than giving us both the same program. So that's why we want to do this. So what did we do in Bahrain? The goal when we coordinated with Tamkeen and Mindcette was to collect 3 samples. First of all, a nationally representative sample. Our target was 500. Actually, we collected about 650 observations. Some of you may even have participated. We made a lot of phone calls. You may even rejected the chance to participate. We also took a sample of active entrepreneurs. And finally, a sample of elite entrepreneurs. So Tamkeen pointed us in the direction of 100 or so people who were considered to be very successful entrepreneurs. Who were the partners on the project? From Derasat, it was me and my colleague Ijlal Bubshait, who is the director of opinion polls. From Mindcette, we had Kelly and Betsy. And from Tamkeen, our point of contact was Ms. Dima Buchiri, who's been with us at every step. So we collected these 3 samples, and our goal was to answer a group of questions. First of all, what is the distribution of entrepreneurial attributes in Bahrain by sex? Secondly, and this allows for cross-sectional and dynamic comparisons. And secondly, what is the relationship between entrepreneurial attributes and observable indicators of entrepreneurship success? So once we collect this data, our goal is to see, well, is it the case that successful entrepreneurs happen to have better skills or better scores in certain areas than others? So this is a picture of our opinion polls room in Derasat, where our surveyors were collecting the data. Now, the survey was done in the USA previously, or small components of it, very small subcomponents were done in the US, and it has been done in South Africa for approximately, actually, almost 4,000 observations. A slight typo here. So then we did it in Bahrain. We used the same survey that we used in South Africa and the USA, although we modified it for Bahrain by translating it first of all, and secondly adapting the demographic questions. But for the large part, it was the same survey. We had our colleague Jan Fiegelin from South Africa visit to help ensure that the survey was harmonized with what was done in South Africa, which was presented in Istanbul 2018. And the questions, as I mentioned, 72 self-evaluation questions where people to say they strongly agree all the way to strongly disagree. We also ask people generic demographic questions. What is your sex? Where do you live? What is your education level? And some entrepreneurial activity questions. Do you have a business? What sector is it in? That kind of thing. We used Derasat's survey data collection facilities, and we also hired surveyors to do these surveys. And then one of our other project partners was the Statistics Office, the Information and E-Government Authority, who gave us data on the distribution of sex, age, and a governorate in Bahrain, so that we could ensure that our sample was in fact nationally representative. What does our sample look like? You can see here there's 3 graphs. So if we look at the big one here, so we got much more. Actually, incorrect. It should be female rather than male, so sorry about that labeling error. We got about 250 females and around 430 males taking part in the survey. And you can see the age distribution was pretty flat across the different age groups. We only sampled adults. And then also it's pretty flat across the 4 major governorates in Bahrain. Now, after we collected the data, we did the statistical analysis. So we use what's called factor analysis. And this is the technique which is standard in social psychology and has been adapted for this specific task by Kelly and Mindcette. So the goal of factor analysis, the answers to the 72 questions is to assume that the answers to the 72 questions are actually based on a smaller number of attributes. So rather than saying that people have 72 different skills, they actually have a smaller number, say around 10, and that these determine their answers to these 72 questions. Now, we use statistical techniques to determine, first of all, the number of factors, the unique factor that each of the 72 questions depends upon, and the gross explanatory power of the model. To what extent did this statistical model actually explain what's going on? And we used the same 72 questions as in previous surveys, but we did not assume the same factors or relationships between factors and questions. So, for example, whereas we expected leadership to be important, we didn't assume that leadership would be important, nor did we assume it would be as important as it was in South Africa or the USA. So what did the results look like? So these are the different skills that we found for men and for women in order of importance. So in the percentage after each one is the importance of this factor in people's entrepreneurial ability. So for men, you can see perseverance, diligence, entrepreneurial desire, resourcefulness, leadership, willingness to experiment, and individuality in descending order of importance. And for women, there was some overlap. So perseverance, diligence, entrepreneurial desire, and resourcefulness were all important. Individuality was more important for women than it was for men. And then we had a different trait, and this underlies this exposes the differences in sexes, is that they had a trait which is evaluation of others, which is the extent to which you are able to read people's or understand people's intentions, desires, and skills. One interesting question from the perspective of those in charge of implementing Economic Vision 2030 is what do the responses look like, or the distribution of skills look like by age group? Here it is for men. So the bars on the left in each cluster, so each cluster refers to one of the skills, and the bars on the left are the youngest people, and the bars on the right are the oldest people. So most traits seem to be more present among youth, especially perseverance, entrepreneurial desire, and individuality. And leadership and willingness to experiment peak in contrast for the Middle Ages or middle-aged people, which may be due to confidence. That's just a post hoc speculation on my side. For women, it looks quite different. And again, this is why it's so important to have a test that distinguishes between men and women. If we'd lump them all together, then we'd end up with something quite distorted. So here, you can see that things tend to go up more as you get older rather than going down. Perseverance, diligence, and resourcefulness are more present among the old than they are among the young. And entrepreneurial desire, whereas entrepreneurial desire and resourcefulness do tend to be more present among the young. Now, a key takeaway from the economic vision practitioners is that entrepreneurial desire for both men and women is in addition to being an important entrepreneurial attribute, much more present for young people, whether it's men or women. What about some international comparisons? So so we don't have complete data for the US. We only have some of them. But for RSA, which is the Republic of South Africa, we have the same attributes. So Bahrainis tend to be higher on all traits, though before we get too excited and conclude that this means that Bahrainis are better entrepreneurs, this probably in my opinion, likely reflects intercultural differences in self-assessments rather than intercultural differences in actual ability. So I wouldn't put too much weight. This is sort of suggestive, but you can't really draw any firm conclusions from these kind of comparisons until you actually gather more data. But it is interesting to look at. And in the entrepreneurship domain, in terms of aggregate outcomes, you can see that USA is much better than Bahrain and South Africa in terms of producing world-class entrepreneurs, despite the fact that it scored lower in entrepreneurial desire. So that's why we shouldn't get too carried away. But it's instructive nonetheless. What about the relationship between are measures of entrepreneurial ability and outcome success measures. While for men, being an entrepreneur was positively associated with entrepreneurial desire. So people who had a strong desire to be entrepreneurs tend to be better ones, or tend to be, more likely to be ones. That's unsurprising. They're actually more likely to have their business be successful. And they also had significantly more employees in their companies. So it seems that, consistent with mainstream belief, wanting to be an entrepreneur is a very important indicator of success. And you can't really, and this is important, I guess, for family businesses where people may get shoved into being coerced, emotionally coerced into taking the reins. Wanting to be an entrepreneur is an important determinant of success. For men. For women, you get similar results in the entrepreneurship desire context, but somewhat bizarrely or unexpectedly, we found that resourcefulness had a negative effect. Now, these are preliminary results, and I haven't had a chance to sit down with Kelly and dive into the data more deeply. But again, an important takeaway is that for men and women, we're getting something different. So what are the next steps? So we're going to do some more analysis to really nail down the factors that we've picked out for Bahrain, and we're going to do some more thorough international comparisons, especially with the minutiae of the South Africa data. And in particular, we want to gather more data in Bahrain with the elite entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, so far, if any of you are in the room, the elite entrepreneurs have not been as willing as we would have desired to participate in the survey. So we've got we need more data from elite entrepreneurs so we can really compare them to the non-entrepreneurs in the population. And then after that, we'll sit down with Tamkeen and start discussing with them how one might be able to tailor their programs at the individual level, once they know that people have different skills and they can measure those skills, how they might tailor their programs so that people benefit more from these kind of interventions. So that's what I wanted to present. And before we open for Q&A, I wanted to ask a couple of questions for my colleagues. Now, first to Kelly, there is a widespread belief, which even I subscribe to, before this project, that to a large extent, entrepreneurs are born. So an individual is born as an entrepreneur, and if they're not born an entrepreneur, there's more or less nothing you can do about it. Maybe you can help a little bit here and there, but ultimately it's something which is almost genetically determined. But actually, that may not be the case, or is it, Kelly? What would you in your years of studying entrepreneurship?
Well, it actually isn't just my years of studying entrepreneurship, which, as anyone can tell, have been a lot of years. The research literature on entrepreneurship is very clear that entrepreneurs are, in fact, not born. They are, in fact, made. So that's one of those unpleasant economic assumptions. It's really, really strange to be bookended by two economists. For a social psychologist, that just makes you nervous. It should, he says, yes, and it does. And you also need to remember that I'm the one who is supposed to be low on communication. So I want you to give me a break. Now, the literature is very clear. There's one thing in the data here that I want to point out to you because I don't want you leaving the room with a misimpression. One of the things that you will notice from all the data that Omar showed you is that entrepreneurial desire is lower overall than all the rest of the dimensions. We're supposed to be measuring entrepreneurial potential, right? Is anybody made nervous by the fact that entrepreneurial desire is lower? Well, you shouldn't be. And the reason you shouldn't be is that this is a nationally representative sample, as was the sample in South Africa. In other words, it generalizes to the entire population. So in most countries, the percentage of people who are in fact entrepreneurs ranges from a low of something like 1% in some countries to a high of maybe 15 or 20% in others. But it's not a whole lot higher. There are a few countries that are higher than that, but if you look at the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor data, the proportion of people who are in business in any country in any given year is small. Well, those are the people with the entrepreneurial desire. But the country as a whole doesn't have it, or the entire country would be entrepreneurs. So don't be concerned by the fact that the entrepreneurial desire scores are lower than others.
Thank you, Kelly. Now, I guess that's good news for Bahrain, because Bahrain is seeking to be more entrepreneurial, as in the part about the fact that entrepreneurs aren't born. So then the question to my colleague Yalmo is, what is Bahrain doing to make its population more entrepreneurial?
Okay, big question. Let me give you a mini history lesson just for context. Those of you who attended the plenary session yesterday morning will have heard that this country has a long, very long and impressive tradition of entrepreneurship and commerce. It has been a hub of trade for literally millennia. And what then changed, not only in Bahrain, across the Arabian Peninsula in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, is they discovered oil. And who got the oil revenue? The government, which then splurged it out on all other parts of the economy. And that reshaped the, if you like, the economic preferences of the population and created a paradigm where most people's preferred choice became or came to be to work in the public sector, for the government, job security, better benefits, etc. And the old entrepreneurial traditions somehow seem to wither away. And this is very much still the paradigm that you see in parts of the region. Now, Bahrain, although it was the first country to discover oil, and it actually last year announced its biggest oil discovery ever, early on recognized that it wasn't as generously endowed with this black gold as some of its neighbors, and therefore made a deliberate, proactive decision already in the 60s to start reshaping the economy, start moving away from oil, and as a result, it has been pursuing this deliberate economic diversification strategy with accelerating speed and growing ambitions, and it was in the early 90s that an entity called the Bahrain Development Bank was set up for the purpose of supporting new companies, and then of course 12 years ago, 2006, Tamkeen as part of a broader reform package. And Tamkeen is an interesting entity. I won't overwhelm you with all the details, but really its main raison d'etre was to realize this economic vision objective that Omar referred to, of putting the private sector at the forefront of driving growth in this country. And it has really tried to pursue that goal through two main pillars. Number one is developing the local human capital, upskilling people, changing people's attitudes, helping them along in their careers. And in fact, in reality, entrepreneurship has been a very important aspect of this. Number two is supporting private sector companies, making it easier to set up companies, making it easier to grow companies, etc., etc. Now, 12 years later, I think something like $3 billion has been spent, so the question arises: what has been achieved in terms of making progress towards these objectives? And like most good questions in economics, it doesn't necessarily have very unequivocal or easy answers. But when people ask me this particular question. I think that the main answer to the question actually goes beyond those numbers. And the reason why it goes beyond those numbers is when we go out there and survey people, we talk to ordinary Bahrainis, people living in this country, regardless of their age and background, the default choice that, remember, not so terribly long ago used to be a safe government job, now is people want to set up their own company. 70% of young Bahrainis are saying they want to set up their own company. And yes, there's a lot of support available for entrepreneurship from entities like Tamkeen and the Bahrain Development Bank, etc. But still, this is not a case of resting on a bed of roses, however much support you get. So these people are making a positive, proactive choice when they say they want to do that. What do the numbers tell us? In Bahrain, to set up a company, you need to get something known as a CR, a corporate registration. And there are now in the order of 80,000 active CRs in this country. That number is quite close to the number of Bahraini citizens working in the private sector. Now, you should not conclude from this that every Bahraini working in the private sector is an entrepreneur, but for the size of this economy, for its population base, entrepreneurship is a popular choice, is an established choice. The economy today is a diverse economy where more than 80% of the GDP comes from the non-oil sector. And new companies keep getting created at the rate of 5 to 10,000 a year. So a lot has changed over the past 12 years. It has been a transformative change. What I think has not changed, I think if I may end with a bit of a qualification, is I think what we've definitely achieved over the past 1 to 2 decades is what I call entrepreneurship Mark 1. I want to set up my company. I can set up my company. What does my company tend to look like right now? It tends to be a retail shop or a coffee shop or a subcontracting firm in the construction sector. So sort of small service companies, primarily in the closed sector of the economy. And of course, as Kelly might agree with me, not all entrepreneurs were created or shaped equal. In order to take this story forwards, what we're trying to do increasingly is push people in the direction of growth, so scale-ups rather than just startups, creativity, understanding the market needs, identifying the market gaps, moving beyond the comfort zone of companies where you have low initial capital requirements and low running costs, towards something that can then truly help reshape this company. But I think when we look at what's been done over the past 10, 20 years, I think we are off to a pretty good start.
Thank you. So yeah, just to close that off before we have some Q&A, our plan is to continue running the survey in every couple of years in Bahrain so that we have a good sense of how entrepreneurial attributes are evolving in Bahrain, and then hopefully we will be able to also conduct similar surveys in other Gulf countries. Our hope is to do it in Saudi Arabia over the next year, so that we can also have some good comparison points, and hopefully that will help policymakers refine the policies that are in place to make Bahrain more entrepreneurial and to make its entrepreneurs more successful. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for questions to our experts or for comments.
While the mic is coming, let me thank Tamkeen for its support of this project all the way through. It wouldn't be done without them. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to reaffirm our gratitude to Tamkeen for the financial and logistical support.
Just a question about how to interpret the self-reported aspect. So I know the CDC in the USA, every year they call people and ask them about their weight and height, and they know that they realize basically that women lie about their weight and men lie about their height, but they lie in different ways, but they're both lying. And so when you ask people to report on how diligent they seem to be or how resourceful or how good at leadership they are, how can you interpret that safely?
Well, we don't actually ask them that question. As you described it, what you're talking about is a conceptual dimension. And we don't ask the conceptual dimension, we ask individual items that then find their way into a variety of conceptual dimensions. Yes, I can. When I begin a project, I can always find the resources I need. I suppose, and these are not yes/no answers. These are 6-point scaled answers. So, in terms of, when you ask somebody to tell you weight or height, that's a binary answer. It's either going to be true or it's not. So in surveys such as this, the only worry is that people will self-inflate a little bit. But I don't know that there's a reason to believe that sort of self-presentation differs from country to country, from dimension to dimension. And one of the dimensions on this test is supposed to end up with low numbers. So if you were going to try to self-present, you might not pick that up, and it would show. So I think it's not a general problem, and we give orienting instructions that basically say, we're interested in your attitudes about entrepreneurship. There are no right or wrong answers. Everybody is told exactly that, and then they answer.
And just to add from an economist's perspective, so in general, whenever you do psychometric tests which involve a self-assessment and there may be a bias towards presenting yourself better than you actually are, empirically, it turns out that doesn't affect the ranking of people. So even though if you asked us even if you were to ask someone, how diligent are you? And you have to ask me and you, if I'm actually more diligent than you, I'll inflate and you'll inflate, and it'll still turn out that my inflated score is higher than your inflated score. So you can still actually conduct, as long as you're interested in the ranking and you can still use the deviated distribution because it preserves the things that are most important for interventions. And in addition to that, as Kelly mentioned, the actual survey is presented in a way which pushes people towards being, relatively speaking, less deceptive, because this is not like they're coming for a job interview and we're asking them, do you work well in teams? And no one's going to say, I don't work well in teams. Whereas here it's a very abstract survey, and that tends to at least massively decrease the amount of the...
Yeah, and actually one of the things that is interesting to me about this is that across South Africa and Bahrain, there are 2 items in the 72 that have never loaded on a factor analysis for females or males in either one of the 2 countries. One of those items is, I strive to master every new activity I undertake. Now, let me say, if you were trying to self-inflate, I'd think you'd give me a pretty high answer on that. The other one is, people consider me a nonconformist. Well, if you think about what your stereotype of an entrepreneur is for an answer to a question like that, the stereotype is, yeah, man, of course I'm a nonconformist. Look at me, I'm not working in a corporate environment, I've got my own company. So there are little indications like that suggest that self-presentation is not a big problem.
Okay. Any other questions?
Well, sir, you'd mentioned 80,000 CRs registered in Bahrain. So would you have any idea, I mean, like, how much would you bifurcate that for the expatriate population versus the local population? That's part one of my question. And part two would be that, in my opinion, the SME, MSME segment is pretty much expat-driven. The small odd jobs, the smaller enterprises, very small retail enterprises, and even as you mentioned, the salons and the coffee shops and the smaller thing are pretty much expatriate-driven. So, what initiatives would you actually, or what initiatives are you looking at to actually promote that, or how would it? I mean, what's your vision in perspective of that?
Okay. Have we looked at the nationality breakdown? Not in detail, not to my knowledge. I think part of the issue is that when we look at these corporate registrations, these are all Bahraini legal persons. They are locally incorporated companies. So that, in a sense, is the relevant category. Obviously, there are companies that are all Bahraini owned. There are companies that are joint ventures, mixed ownership. There are companies that are fully non-national owned. Bahrain is a country that, as a rule, accepts 100% foreign ownership, and since that is the law of the land, then that doesn't seem to present itself as the immediately kind of interesting question to us. I don't think that the way you describe the situation is entirely accurate. So certainly in terms of looking at the people who come to Tamkeen to ask for support in the area of entrepreneurship. So these are all Bahraini incorporated companies, and they all, in principle, qualify for that support. I think we tend to see a clear majority of Bahraini owned companies. I think what may be a little bit more accurate to say is when we look at the employment a track record of the smaller companies, let's say the sort of micro enterprises, fewer than five employees, which of course in percentage terms are a very, very big proportion of the overall pool in this country. It is very common for these companies to hire low-cost expatriates, and I suspect they have historically done that as a way of managing their costs, because this is cheaper and perhaps offers them more flexibility. I think in general we see a very entrepreneurially active Bahraini national population, and one that is becoming much more so. As I said, in the enterprise support, all Bahrain incorporated companies qualify for support. When it comes to specifically expatriate run companies, I think one of the strategic opportunities there that you would have heard of yesterday is encouraging Bahrain as a platform economy, as a place where creative foreign entrepreneurs come to set up their companies, because Bahrain offers them a competitive regulatory framework, offers them access to talent, and offers them access to markets.
I would add two things to that. One is that a very early question in the survey, I think it was the question number 2, if it wasn't 1, is, are you a Bahraini citizen? And if the answer was no, that's where the interview concluded. So in the survey, there's nothing but Bahraini citizens. And as for the size of the companies, just to provide a little perspective, in the US, something like 80+% of the firms in America have fewer than 20 people.
And just to add, so as Kelly mentioned, the survey was done on Bahrainis only. I know xenophobia is flavor of the month in the world these days. That's not the reason why we only did Bahrain. We did it because we had finite survey resources and we wanted to focus the survey on the groups that Tamkeen's programs target, which I believe Tamkeen's programs are more or less exclusively targeted towards Bahrainis. So that's why. But in the future, were resources to be provided, would be very interested in studying the expatriate community as well. You had a follow-up you mentioned? Yes.
And again, that's the same thing as in South Africa, because an early question in the South Africa study was also, are you a citizen?
You wanted to respond?
So, I mean, coming straight to your point where you said that we provide a very competitive option in the region. In order to give you a very simple two-location comparison, I have one Jebel Ali, and the newer version or the newer option available is Sohar. 100% ownership, cheaper land, cheaper electricity in Sohar. Jebel Ali, the rents are high, CR costs are higher. That's from pure expatriate point of view. So from your economist perspective, I'm just thinking, like, obviously that's not an option in Bahrain. How good or how bad would it be for Bahrain to set up something like Sohar or Jebel Ali? Should they do it? If yes, if no, why?
I'll take another question and then let you answer.
Okay, fine.
So who else would like to ask a question? We had somebody in that. Yes, please.
Hi. Thank you, gentlemen, for this study and for your time. So I have two questions, and I'm a Bahraini entrepreneur. So my first question is how we can quantify and measure success of entrepreneurship on a national wide. That's my first question. Is there a way that we can say that, yes, entrepreneurship has been successful, and because we need to give it time, right? So probably over 10 years or 20 years. Statistics tell us that 80% of startups fail within the first 5 years. So how we can define success, that we can say firmly, yes, Bahrain has achieved a successful entrepreneurship program? That's my first question. The second question, I have benefited a lot from Tamkeen, and there is no doubt that Tamkeen done an amazing job for Bahrainis. However, I think Tamkeen as a variable is providing a biased variable for Bahrain, because it's an advantage that no other countries provide, or not so many countries provide. So if we compare ourselves to the world in terms of entrepreneurship, we have an advantage. So from a research perspective, do you think that this could be kind of an outlier that affect the result of the research that we have done for Bahrain? And if we eliminate Tamkeen as a variable, won't that give a better and more accurate picture about entrepreneurship in Bahrain relatively and comparatively to the whole world?
So
Thank you.
I'll answer the first part and I'll let Yarmo answer the second part. So in terms of measuring how entrepreneurship is successful, at the aggregate level, you have things like, you have rudimentary measures such as the contribution of SMEs to GDP, the percentage of the workforce employed in SMEs, the profitability of SMEs. So they go one level beyond whether they succeed or fail. And you can see, if you look at different countries, you can see there are trends in time, the percentage of patents and innovations done by SMEs. So there are all sorts of ways of measuring the contribution to gross economic activity that comes from SMEs, and as that varies over time, that can give you an idea of how successful your policies have been. Yarmo?
Yeah, look, I don't know that we should take Tamkeen out of the equation anyway, because at the end of the day, when we surveyed the population, we found that attitudes in Bahrain very similar to the comparator countries. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be, the starting point doesn't seem to be fundamentally different. And as Kelly said, people aren't born entrepreneurs. People become entrepreneurs or can develop as entrepreneurs. And I think, in a sense, the whole point of Tamkeen was to make this a priority of the country's diversification strategy. And if now, from all that we've seen, we can infer it's kind of worked, then I think that's something to be proud of. Your definition about your question about success is an excellent question. I think we've been successful on a number of fronts. Is there room for improvement? Yes, I think this is a very dynamic agenda, and there's a lot more that can be done to increase the economic impact of SMEs or startup companies in this country. And I think one big shift that needs to happen, and we're now kind of trying to proactively work on, is push companies to think beyond Bahrain. Bahrain is as you will have all seen, a nice country, but it's a small country. So if you want to have the opportunity to scale up as a company, you need to be ready to move and operate beyond Bahrain. This hasn't been seen as a priority in the past because the population has grown rapidly and government expenditure has grown rapidly, and the cake has grown bigger year after year after year. I think in the new economic environment, it is a much bigger priority, and I think a lot that can be done there. Going back to the gentleman in the front, your question. Can we do something like Sahara or whatever in Bahrain? I think the view of the government has been for a long time that, partly given the size of the country, they don't want to go for jurisdictional fragmentation. They don't want to create free zones. All of, as people sometimes say, all of Bahrain should be a free zone, and that's why things like 100% foreign ownership are the norm. Now, it should be a level playing field for all companies here, and conversely then all the companies that incorporate locally are also legally GCC companies, so in principle they have the ability to operate beyond Bahrain. Now, that one of the implications of this, of course, is whatever you do, Bahrain still has its underlying value propositions, which mean that it's not going to be equally good at everything. It's not going to be equally competitive at everything. It doesn't have any deep sea ports in the way that Oman does, which doesn't mean that it cannot serve as a distribution hub, but it's not going to be on the major global shipping routes. Whatever may happen, it obviously has an issue with land availability, but I think there is a fundamental value proposition which is about human capital, it's about regulation, location, and also about cost and value for money, which is competitive for a lot of companies, and it's the companies for which it is compelling that this country needs to focus on attracting and developing and nurturing.
Could I break in before too many more people leave? I don't know what the failure rate is in Bahrain, but when people say 80-90% of companies fail in the first 5 years, I've actually written a chapter that debunks that for the U.S. The Small Business Administration in the U.S. Says 55%. So any number in the U.S. that's higher than 55% is actually a myth. And people have tried to track down where the 90% of companies fail came from, and nobody's been able to do it.
And with that, we don't want to keep you from lunch any longer, so thanks very much. We'll be available at the top if anyone wants to ask any further questions, but thanks very much for joining us today.